So, if you know the theme of this week is home, and you've ever watched this vlog or ever met me, you know I'm going to talk about Portland, but not today. I figure I would set the stage by spending today talking about the other towns I've called home. I've lived in a couple of different cities in my adult life. I'm from Dallas, Texas, and that's where I lived most of my life. But I've also lived in Austin, which is where I got this Waterloo Records t-shirt. Austin used to be called Waterloo, so there's a lot of stuff in Austin called Waterloo, including this really cool record store. I lived in Austin from 1986 to 1997. I went to college there, I went to law school there, I worked there for a few years as a lawyer, and then I left. And Austin is one of the best places to live anywhere. It's sort of like Portland, but hotter, and it's in Texas. And in some ways, it's kind of more liberal because it's in Texas. There's a lot of the people there sort of define themselves in opposition to how backward a lot of the rest of Texas is. So there's a sort of loud and proud progressive streak in the city. That's nice if you happen to be progressive. And one thing I really miss about Austin is that when I lived in Austin, well, first of all, I was in my 20s, which was really nice. I'm just kidding. I like the age I am now. But in Austin, I would spend a lot of time listening to live music, and I really like live music, and I don't do that as much now. And some of this has to do with getting older and having a kid and that kind of stuff. But I do miss the live music in Austin quite a lot. Austin was where I lived when I figured out I didn't want to be a corporate lawyer, and I did a whole other video about that, which you can watch here. But after I decided to change jobs, I ended up changing cities. I moved to Washington, D.C. I was very lucky in D.C. because there's a great neighborhood called Adams Morgan. A friend of a friend of a friend of mine owned an apartment there, a very nice apartment, and he wanted someone to sublet it from him for a really low rent. Washington was the first place I ever lived that really had mass transit. As I learned more about urbanism, I became more and more a fan of mass transit. The thing I was not prepared for in Washington was that it gets really cold. And I grew up my whole life in Texas, and for me, really cold is 60 degrees Fahrenheit. And I moved to Washington in January during a really bad winter. It wasn't the worst winter I had there, but it was a pretty bad winter. And I remember very distinctly waking up one morning and I was late for work, so I just washed my hair and I ran out of the house with wet hair. And I was walking to get on the subway, which we call the metro. And it felt like somebody was sort of pulling my hair. I really felt like maybe like a bird had grabbed all of my hair. And I reached up and felt it, and my hair was just freezing. The ice crystals were forming and sort of pulling against my scalp. And it was kind of weird. I'd never had my hair freeze before. You would think that the summers would be mild, but the summers are actually worse than Texas because they're really just muggy, and the heat and humidity kind of combine into this Voltron of discomfort that just sucks the soul slowly out of you. So I don't recommend the weather in Washington, but it's a very exciting place to live. I moved from Washington back to Dallas, and Dallas isn't exactly a bad place. There's a lot going on there that's good. There's some really interesting neighborhoods, there's some really interesting parts of the city, but on the whole city is very flat and very paved and feels like a big suburb. It doesn't feel like it's a huge city. It's a really big city. I'll have to look it up, but it's one of the biggest cities in the country. Somehow it still feels kind of small. Michelle Schacht wrote a song called Memories of East Texas, and Dallas is not technically in East Texas, but I think the lyric applies. She said, "Their lives ran in circles so small, they thought they'd seen it all, and they couldn't make a place for a girl who'd seen the ocean." I certainly don't regret the time I spent in Dallas, but when it was time to go, it was time to go.